shoulder of Lieber and
Brucha.
Buckman. And they were my great-grandparents, the parents of my mother's mother. And so she looks very much like my grandmother, who I knew. I did not know her, but she looks very much like my grandmother and my mother, and I think Addie. They were lived in a shtetl between Minsk and Pinsk before the turn of the century, and the turn of the 20th century, and they had a boarding house that she ran, and he was the head of a crew of felchers or of timber people that would go out into the woods and cut trees, and so they were actually pretty well off. They had 11 children while they were living in Russia, and then about 1905, when some of the boys were going to be drafted into the Tsar's army, they decided to leave and come to America.
Because when Jews were drafted into the Tsar's army, you were basically drafted for life.
That's right. It was like a 50-year thing.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't, you didn't, practically never got home, plus it was going to be a hard war, and you also couldn't follow the kosher laws or any of the Jewish laws.
Probably had no chance of advancing, so that meant you were always
Yeah, you're always a peasant.
cannon followers.
Right. So anyway, that's when a lot of Jews came over. So they sold their boarding house, and so they had enough cash for the entire family to go together. Most families, one or two people would go. They would get somewhat settled and make with any money they could, and then they'd bring another brother over or a mother over or something, and they'd slowly bring as much of the family over to the States as they could. But they were able to sell out, and it was early enough, and so they were able to bring the whole family at the time. They had a 15-year-old daughter who went over with them, but she was already in love with Max Maisel, and that is my grandmother, Louise, and my grandfather, Max. He was the felcher, the sort of first aid man for the foresters that would go out. And so he knew the family very well, and he did not have any money. His family was very poor, and so they did not have any money. So when the Buckmans went to the States, they went to Hamburg and then got on a ship in Hamburg and came over here. He slowly worked his way across from Minsk to Hamburg, and he told me once that he would travel on foot or get a ride with someone, and then when his money ran out, he would stop and find wherever he was. He'd be in a little village or a little town, and he'd find some sort of work to have enough money to go on to the next trip. So it took him quite a while.
And what year was this again?
This was sometime around 1905.
Mm-hmm. And how old was he?
He was probably under 20 at the time.
And she was 15.
She was 15.
Okay.
So I'm not sure exactly how old he was.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, he finally got back over there. By that time, the Buckmans were already in the Lower East Side, and they had gone into the pillow business right from the start when he got there.
Wait, do you think that Max and Louise, they probably weren't in touch at all during those years? So Louise wouldn't really have known?
I'm not sure it was years. No, I'm sure she knew that he probably told her that he was going to come.
Right.
And she was only 15,
Right.
so I'm sure her parents wanted her to wait, right?
Well, those days, 15 was probably not too young to get married. I don't know. In the Jewish community, I'm not sure. But in any case, I think that they were, and they could have written, you know. So when he finally got over there, the Buckman, Lieber was already in had started a business and was making, I'm not sure exactly the timing of this, but he started this pillow business, and the story that I always got was that Lieber was sort of an intuitive engineer, and he...
A tinkerer.
Yeah, and he, in this business, he developed two machines that were used to sort and clean and prepare the down for the pillows. And with that, he was able to have a pretty good business, rather than
His
having it
older
all
sons
hand
worked
up.
with him?
And all the sons worked with him, and over the years, they at some point they got when the United States went into the First World War. By that time, they were big enough, and they got a big contract for pillows for the Army, and that really led them to be quite well off. And what they did was they took each of the sons, would go and start another factory in another city. So one son went to Boston, one son went to Chicago, one to Philadelphia, one to Baltimore. My grandfather took he had Brooklyn. The original factory was still in Manhattan that Lieber ran, and my grandfather was Max had the factory in Brooklyn.
Who'd married into the family. He wasn't
Married
just
into the
son.
family, and he had the factory there, and he was, what was I gonna say? Oh, it was across from the factory that they owned was across from the Brooklyn Navy Yard. I remember going there a few times. I remember particularly I used to like to go, they had like Matson Construction, they had a vault, a safe, a walk-in vault, and we had a big, one of those heavy metal doors with the wheel crank and everything. I used to like to go in and play in there. David and I used to go do that. And so, and then his sons, Ben and Ted, also went into the business with my grandfather Max. Now, Lieber, who was the head of the family and was quite well off, at some point he lived down the block from where my grandparents lived on President Street in Eastern Parkway of New York. So they lived. My grandmother was very close with them, and then they bought an
So was
estate.
Louise kind of the caretaker for her parents as they got older?
I think so.
Mm-hmm.
I think so. I'm not. It's not.
You were a little boy, sure.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure that they were alive when I was born. I think they probably were dead by then. I don't remember any stories when they were in that, because I know.
Ida was younger.
So they still had, Lieber and Brucha had two more children, and they were born in the United States. So one of them, Ida, was only 13 years older than my mother. So they were aunt and niece, but also almost closer to cousins,
Sisters.
because the Lieber lived very close to where my mother grew up, so they were really very, very close. And then Joe was their other son that was born in New York, and he became an orthopedist. So he was the only male who didn't go into the business. There were, I think, two other sisters, and one was Ida Poland's mother, and the other one, I'm not quite sure who the other one was. In any case, Lieber bought an estate, sort of a summer estate up in Willimantic, Connecticut. and it had a lake and a big field, and the whole family used to go there, and there's one big house, and then my grandfather used to put up sort of an old, a big tent, like bigger than this room, and they put up a tent, and my mother, in her sort of pre-teens and early teens years, every summer, that's where they would go for at least a good part of the summer.
There's some early photos of
There
that.
was some photos of that, and she used to tell stories of being in Willimantic, Connecticut.
And it was more like a yurt, so there was a floor and the steps up to it, and it was spacious.
It was quite spacious. And then, I know she always used to tell me stories. There was people used to come from the old country, and my grandfather would get them a job, and her grandfather, and they'd sometimes come and stay up at the country. And she told a story about the fellow they called Yankel the Greener, because he was a greenhorn, you know, and he was trying to thank my grandfather for helping him out, and he wanted to figure out something he could do, and the field, the hay had grown up pretty high, and so he decided, well, that needs to be cut. So the easiest way to do that, he set fire to the field. And that was the way. And so there was this terrible fire there.
Oh my gosh.
I remember that was one of my mother's favorite stories.
So, and I know I should know the answer to this then. So the people in the picture, that's not Max.
No,
No.
that's Max's father-in-law and mother-in-law.
Right, okay.
Okay, so that picture was taken on their...
So those are the Liebers, right? 'Cause-
So that's Lieber Buckman.
Right.
Those are the Buckmans.
Right.
Lieber and Brucha Buckman. And they had a...
They were the ones that started the pillow
Factory, right.
And so they had a 60th anniversary party, and this was the photo taken for that 60th anniversary.
And they had the menu too.
It was in Brooklyn. It was in Brooklyn at one of the kosher caterers they used to have on Ocean Parkway. There were 2 or 3 sort of beyond Kings Highway going down towards the ocean, and there were these big halls, and they had, you know, kosher kitchens, and they would have these things, and so there was this sit-down dinner,
The French menu.
the
Right.
French multi-course menu for their anniversary party.
Right, so Lieber and Brucha had the daughter, which was Louise,
my grandmother.
which was your grandmother.
We actually don't know what her name was. We need to
Really?
check the genealogy record. Well,
I-
Grandpa Max called her Lizzie, and so we thought her name was Elizabeth, and that is the reason Ada Elizabeth is Ada Elizabeth. They were naming her from my grandmother, and
But my cousin says, no, her name was not Elizabeth, her name was Louise, but he used to just call her sort of as an affectionate name, Lizzie. And so she was very willful woman. We can tell stories about those sorts of stories another time. But
Wait, I have another question about Lieber. Do you think he was part of like a Landsmannschaft?
oh no, he was. The whole family was. So they had from their group, and I used to, as a boy, we used to go once a year in
grandfather.
Fallsburg, New Jersey, near the coast. There were chicken farms.
Oh, in South Jersey, were
South
there all
Jersey.
those Jewish chicken farms?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
We used to go to a sort of
Like
a
Vineland.
Vineland, that area. We used to go to it was not quite like Concord, but it was more than a boarding house. It was a hotel, a Jewish hotel, and everything. And this once a year they would have their meeting, and they would all come together. That's why the cemetery where my parents are buried, grandparents, and the whole family is buried was the Landsmannschaft bought a section of one of the Jewish cemeteries in that area of Queens overlooking Manhattan. And so that's where everyone had a certain number of plots there. And they used to, and this is part of the thing with Yankel the Greener, they used to help support each other, and they used to give loans to each other
Right.
in order to get businesses started. Okay, that's enough for now.
Say goodbye for now. Oh, Saved by the Bell.
And the kugels for Isaac's bris are ready.